Good morning, crime community. I'm here to finish reading out the conclusion to um, Deborah Gussman's introduction to Married and Married or Single by Catherine Maria Sedgwick. For Sedgwick, how one treats those conventionally considered inferior is a reflection on the virtue of the supposedly superior character. For example, early in Married or Single, the novel hero, lawyer Archibald Lissell, witnessed a riot near the Opera House and soon after appeared in court in his vocation for a young man who had been drawn into the riot. The lad was an Irishman, and after his acquittal, an Irish heart burst bound, and he told the court that Lissell had volunteered to defend him while the young gentleman's bones were still aching with the smashing blow he gave him, meaning no harm. The cleverness of Lissell's defense, his modesty, and his gallantry all combine to suggest that his character is worthy of grace, in contrast to Horace Copley, who looked down on Lissell for standing between poor and devils, or their just retribution, and accused him of being a believer of mesmerism, spiritualism, homeopathy, and hydropathy, and anti-slavery, anti-tariff, anti-capital punishment. Later in the novel, an Irish lad named Pat comes to Lissell's aid in a court case, providing dramatic testimony that absolves his client from the forgery charge. Sedgwick's condescending portrayal of Patrick made it difficult for contemporary readers to accept. He is presented as warm-hearted and also superstitious, barely literate, and prone to lying. At the same time, Pat exemplifies the raw materials of citizenship that Fredericks feels in his obligation of more privileged, benevolent Americans to cultivate. In the letter he writes in defense of Lissell's client, Pat states, "Yes, see, sir, for yees may want to testimony. I learned to write a bit at home and was a far learning better because the boss is as poor as poor president in each country." While the scene is intended to be comical, Pat's testimony reveals his understanding of and desire to achieve the American dream. For Larnon, a poor boy may be a president. As Julia Childs observes about Sedgwick's previous writings, although Sedgwick by no means envisions a classless American society, she does imagine the United States as a mediocrity in which upward mobility regards the morally deserving. However, as Susan K. Harris suggests, rather than serving as evidence of Sedgwick's marginality of the American literary tradition, these articles towards immigrants, lower-class whites, and African Americans indicate her intense involvement in the political debateness of her time. And we might add her sufficiently in reconciling her belief in the ideals of democracy with their fears about the ability of new Americans to achieve those goals. Central to the plot of Married and Single is Sedgwick's exploration of marriage, which emerges as a significant moment of change in the meaning of marriage and female identity in the United States. The moment was punctuated by a cultural context over the presumed indissolubility of the marriage union and the women's rights law reformed as it pertained to child custody, property, earnings, separate legal identity, and self-possession, contents that were taking place both publicly and formally in the court and privately and informally in domestic arrangements of individuals. New York State from 1820 through the 20th century played a crucial role symbolically and practically in the production of the American law of marriage because New York City was at the center of the print culture of the nation and because New York State exported more lawyers. New York law, both as texts and practices, always spread widely, in addition to the prominent lawyer father, Theodore Sedgwick, who served in the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate representing Massachusetts. Sedgwick had three older brothers, Theodore, Harry, and Robert, each of whom practiced law in New York. The hero of Married and Single, Archibald Lissell, is a New York City attorney as well, which is perhaps not surprising given that Sedgwick was frequently in the company of lawyers and others as well versed in the contemporary legal issues. Sedgwick alludes to her awareness of changes affecting the legal status of women during the conversation between Grace and her sister, Eleanor, following the domestic squabble between Eleanor and her husband, Frank, which Grace had witnessed, Eleanor attempts to defend her marriage and marriage in general by telling Grace, if anything goes wrong in the household, then the husband frets at the wife, and we fret at the weather without ever thinking, in either case, that injustice is done to the providence that orders without and within, but the condition of women and wives is ameliorating. Honest and generous men are righting our great legal wrongs, and if our virtues improves with our condition, the time is not far distant, which when such men as Frank will not, Eleanor hesitated, when he will not, like a cross horse, bite his mate whenever the harness galls, interposed Grace. When the legal wrongs of which Eleanor referred through Sedgwick was careful to distance himself from the women's rights movement, the problems mentioned by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the 1848 Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, such as wife beating, dual standards of morality, divorce, child custody, and control over property and wages, were problems stemming from the institution of marriage as it evolved by the middle of the 19th century. Sedgwick addresses many of these problems throughout Married and Single. The first chapter of the novel presents Grace and Eleanor reading a trunk full of old letters, which include those from Aunt Sarah, who discovered soon after the marriage that her husband is idle, coarse, sensual, ill-tempered, a gambler, and a spendthrift. When Sarah goes to her father to see if he can effect an amicable separation, she learns that her husband would listen to no terms and will never give the children to me, but by the compulsion of the law, and the results of the law is uncertain. For my father says the law has neither justice nor mercy for a woman, and I cannot go through the mire of the public trial. I will not expose my children to the after misery of knowing their father's infamy. I will never leave them. Tragically, Sarah's children are killed when their father is in no state to drive, forces them into a carriage where he overturns. The letter and story serves as a cautionary tale of the two young women who are contemplating their future as married or single, and to readers who are doing the same. The range of cases were decided in the early 19th century and solidified, as well as strained long-held assumptions about marriage and laws that supported them. In 1820, the law was designed to reinforce marriage rather than enhance individual freedom or encourage the contempt that marriage implied, the lifelong commitment. As Aunt Sarah learns, courts and litigants share a sense that marital breakup ought to be shaming, and many courts work hard to make sure that shame was experienced and publicly known. The only grounds for divorce were those that clearly broke the contract that was understood as marriage, adultery, sexual incapacity, and an extended period of desertion. Between 1820 and 1860, however, the state legislatures revised their divorce statutes, making divorce more readily available and providing additional grounds for divorce, such as cruelty, drunkenness, and neglect of duty. As a result, divorce rates began to increase, and by the 1850s, public interest and concerns about divorce were revealed in newspapers, magazines, and fiction. These changes in divorce law were intended to keep the marriage bargain static. Rather than inviting husbands and wives to peruse marital freedom, the states, in allowing divorce, were perfecting the script of marriage. During the same period of time, legislatures began to alter the coverture laws that had exemplified marital unity by making a woman's property, labor, and wages her husband's. The married woman's property laws passed in numerous states between 1830 and 1870, which were initially implemented to protect wives' property and assessed from husbands' creditors, were expanded in the many states to include a wife's earnings. They eventually began to chip away at the unified property regime of marriage. The legal changes revealed a cultural shift in the understanding marriage as a political and changeable institution rather than a natural and God-given one. The shift was also provided an opening for the progressive critique of marriage that was central to the women's rights movement. The concept of the indissolubility of marriage, which was at the root of traditional marriage laws, are arguably the central issue of Married or Single, as it touches on both the choices of whether or not to marry as well as the meaning of transformation of a woman from single to married. Hendrik Hartog maintains that the legal status of being a wife one whose economic and political identity were covered by her husband, made citizenship effectively incapable with wifehood. Marriage meant that a woman placed herself in necessary and incapable relation to her husband under his legal power. What rights the wife had over her body, her ideas, her prosperity, her labor existed as rights not possessed by her husband, as rights he lost, he gave, or he abused. Her place in the world, both metaphorically and spatially, was his place in the world. His home was her home wherever she actually lived. Citizenship, a public identity as a participant in public life, would, from this perspective, have been nothing close to a contradiction in terms for a married woman. Nancy Cott developed the idea further, noting the wife's marital dependency so composed her ability to act as herself in public that single women to being potential wives are often being treated as lacking civic independence. Still, from a legal perspective, single women continue to possess the rights that women lost upon entering a marriage, including the right to contract, own, dispose, write wills, engage in most forms of business, testify and demand the obedience and guardianship of her children. Hartog is quick to point out that no one took the idea of marital unity literally. Coverture did not describe a wife's moral or social identity. Moreover, a wife's always remained a person in the law, separate from her husband. The idea of a wife having separate moral identity from her husband, the distinction between public and private identity, the idea that the role of the wife vis-a-vis the Republican family and citizenship will enable Sedgwick to carve out a space between the progressive and sometimes radical ideas of the women's rights movement and the more traditional or conservative views of the roles of the rights of women, both married and single. Catharine Beecher describes a version of this middle space in her treatise on domestic economy, 1842. The success of democratic institutions, as is conceded by all, depends upon the intellectual and moral character of the mass of the people. It is equally conceded that the formation of the moral and intellectual character of the young is committed mainly to the many and tutor to a good home. Through Lefty is self-supporting. Her friendship with Archie and by extension her respectability is scrutinized and questioned by others, whereas Grace, who is also an orphan, interacts with men who both suitors and friends and clearly is buffered by both wealth and presence of extended family. Nevertheless, Sedgwick opens a life of industry and selfishness as both the safest and happiest alternative to marriage, whether a woman is a poor seamstress like Martha Young or a privileged social worker like Julia Travers. Industry and selfishness also provide the surest path to happiness within marriage, as demonstrated by Grace's tirelessly benevolent married sister, Eleanor, as can be seen in the example of Aunt Sarah, as well as in other unhappy marriages in the novel. Sedgwick does not present long-term separation or divorce as a possibility for any of her characters. Through both eventualities were becoming more common and accessible in the United States. Sedgwick was swimming against one tide of social change in the country when she was moving forward in her acceptance of other social changes, such as abolitionism or the value of singlehood for women. How then do we square Sedgwick's defense of unmarried women and single blessedness with the novel's conclusion, which, in concert with the conventions of the marriage plot, suggests that Grace will finally marry? Lee Virginia Chambers, Schiller notes that most antebellum readers and writers would have agreed that a good and true marriage were preferable to being single, and that the conclusion was consistent with the concept of better single than miserably married, an evolution cultural attitude to which Sedgwick work contributed. In the preface, Sedgwick states that we have given, we confess, after some disposition to rebel, the most practical proof of our allegiance to the ancient laws of romance, by making our hero and heroine man and wife, and duly and truly was this disposition to rebel perhaps Sedgwick's allusion to the earlier draft of the novel in which Grace remained single through no evidence of an earlier manuscript with such a conclusion has been found. In an 1856 letter to the author, and Catherine offers a critique of still unpublished text. If I have any faults to suggest, it is that in the latter part of the book, the interest becomes a little too much divided and scattered, and the more I think of it, the more I incline to leave Alice Clifford in the subordinate position she at first occupies and to let things come to their natural conclusions between Grace and Archie. I'm sorry to interfere with your moral and with your title, but I think you have done enough by your own example to illustrate the dignity and beauty of single life and need not to have it on your conscience to do it in your writings. It is not only the desire and all novel readers have for the felicity of the heroine, but I think Alice comes in rather too late to enlist your sympathy sufficiently for her to be allowed to supplant Grace. Minot's advice implies that Sedgwick may have considered an alternative ending to the novel in which Grace remains single and Archibald marries Alice, his and Grace's mutual friend. Such as ending would have been consistent with many defenses of marriage voiced by Grace, Eleanor, and other characters, and with a sensible theme of the novel as implied by the question of the title, both of which suggest that both marriage and singlehood are legitimate choices. It would also, as Minot suggests, illustrate dignify the choice Sedgwick herself made to live a single life. Was Sedgwick swayed by her niece's critique and her appeal to the desire of all novel readers to have the felicity of the heroine and to the marriage plot formula? Did it reflect, as she implies in the preface, the novelist's concession of the allegiance to the ancient laws of romance? Or does the conclusion reflect Sedgwick's complicated and ambivalence about the dignity and beauty of single life? Through the possibility of an alternate ending suggested by Minot's letter is tantalizing. It is not ultimately that Sedgwick chose for her completed novel, to focus on either the alternatives or the answer to the question of married or single. Is to Miss Sedgwick's deliberate focus on the issue of individual agency and conscience. What matters finally is that Grace has the choice to be single or to marry. As Susan K. Harris argues, the middles of the 19th century fiction may be more telling than the formalic ending. If a heroine creates an autonomous self and succeeds in impressing it on her society and her reader for 600 pages, she has left convincing evidence that it can be done. The fact that she gives it up all upon marriage in the last 25 pages should be less of an impact on readers, especially readers themselves, entertaining dreams of autonomy, than the fact that she succeeded. Or as Grace's friends, Miss Clifford, who has given the final words in the novel, states, you are equal to either Fortune or Grace, married or single. Many other prophets by your theories, feminists, few historians, and social scholars engaged in literary recovery continue to challenge, redefine, and expand the canon of American literature, asking questions about the way in which value is assigned to literary text, in ways in which canons are defined, and the political and social effects of such values and definitions. While the early stages of this recovery often focused on uncovering texts that seem to provide heroic examples of proto-feminist and active sentiments, or texts that challenge the literary or cultural values of their times. In Sedgwick's case, Hope Leslie was the example. More recent work has sought to understand the ways in which literary texts construct, reflect, and disseminate cultural meanings that are frequently contradictory and connected to a broad range of cultural practices, beliefs, institutions, and economic, political, and social structures. As we move into the next stage of the recovery movement and develop more nuanced narratives of women's contributions to literary and political history, the complicated roles played by the more moderate women like Catherine Maria Sedgwick must be re-examined. As Laura Romero points out, domesticity does not guarantee any particular textual politics once we cease to read it as a stable marker of difference between the abstractly conceived categories of hegemonic and counterculture. The ideology of female benevolence, which demanded that women act to heal or transform the world, contained both radical and conservative possibilities. This tension is deeply felt in Married or Single. Likewise, the ideal of compassionate marriage and the permanence of marriage, bond that Sedgwick celebrated while nevertheless allowing her to champion singlehood, also aligned her with the more traditional Republican and Protestant values that were being challenged by liberal individualism. Sedgwick's assertion that women could choose their separate sovereign way existed alongside her rejection of the women's rights movement. Her opposition to slavery existed alongside her distance from the abolitionist movement, and her democratic desire to educate workers and assimilate immigrants existed alongside her elitist assumptions about the inherent superiority of her values. These incongruities speak to what Romero describes as the proximity between hegemony and resistance. In the 19th century discourse, Marriage or Single reveals a great deal about the nuances of modern politics and the space it creates for intervention and understanding, as well as its limitations and drawbacks of progressive social change. Despite its happy ending, Sedgwick's final novel may leave contemporary readers feeling discomfited with the question raised in the title and in the text not satisfyingly answering after all. That is the end of the editor's notes. I'm going to read a little bit about the notes here. Sedgwick's first novel, A New England Tale, was published in 1822. Her next three novels, Redwood, 1824, Leslie's Hope, 1827, Clarence in 1830, solidified her reputation as a major contributor to American literature. In 1835, saw the publication of her penultimate full-length novel, The Linwoods, as well as Home, and the first of three widely read domestic novels, which included The Poor Rich Man and the Rich Poor Man, 1836, and Live and Let Live, 1837. In addition, from 1825 through the 1840s, she wrote and published more than 100 tales and sketches, along with biographies, travel writings, and self-help books. A detailed chronology of Sedgwick's life and writings can be found in Damon Bach and Clement Sedgwick Critical Perceptions. This is the end of our talking about Miss Sedgwick, who I think will be going on in the next few days to Mrs. Edgewood, Maria Edgewood, who, as I remember with our studies, is the British contemporary of Miss Sedgwick. So we will be studying about Miss Edgewood in the next few days. So if there's any like and truth, subscribe and like, and have a nice day.